good morning. And I can see that all of you are well rested. You have had a good breakfast and ready to go. I think I'm not going to spend time over biodatas and things like that because those are available in your folders. And so what I will do is that we are starting a little bit later than what we had planned for, and therefore, instead of my opening remarks, I think this is an audience which knows the dilemmas of outer space. If you look back, I think COPUOS was set up way back in the late 1950s, just after the Sputnik launch in 1957. 1959, COPUOS got set up. The CD, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, the agenda item, prevention of an arms race in outer space, got inscribed on the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva in 1982. COPUOS has met regularly. Today it has something like 90+ countries as members. They have met regularly. They have made certain recommendations. Whether it has succeeded in fulfilling the agenda with which it was set up is something that we'll hear about from our experts. The Conference on Disarmament in Geneva has been unable to negotiate anything on outer space since 1982, since the time that the agenda item was inscribed. At times, they have set up ad hoc committees with non-negotiating mandates, but that's about it. And in recent years, even that has proved to be impossible. Another element that has occasionally surfaced in this area has been a group of governmental experts. Now, or GGE, as it is called, the UN Secretary General, there's a resolution in the UN General Assembly, and if it enjoys consensus and financial resources are made available, then the UN Secretary General establishes a group of governmental experts. They come together, they produce a report, but that's about it. Sometimes they even fail to produce a report. Sometimes they do produce a report, but the report, what value the report has depends on how the member countries of the United Nations, what use they make of it. So far, a GGE relating to outer space has not resulted in any negotiations that have produced a legally binding outcome. The last agreements of outer space go back to the 1960s and 70s, essentially, legally binding outcomes. After that, looking at the fact that since negotiations were not going to be possible, efforts have focused on codes of conduct, rules of the road, arrangements like that, voluntary restraints, and so on and so on. Good behavior, as it were. But it's not enough. And meanwhile, of course, as you heard yesterday evening, there are more and more players engaged in outer space activities. There are more and more, I think, there were some slides that were shown yesterday which showed the exponential rise in space debris and the number of space launches taking place, and so on and so on. And so therefore, as space-based assets count for more and more in our daily lives across the world, space will assume greater importance and greater significance. And therefore, to discuss this, we've got 4 well-known experts. I'm going to ask Sophie to kick off. We've sort of divided the responsibilities. Everybody, each of you has 10 minutes. And so over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. Good morning to everyone. Before I begin, a disclaimer. I'm a French diplomat and I'm based in here at the French Embassy, but I'm not going to represent French government's official position. What I'm going to say is definitely influenced by French thinking, but just to make sure that we have the same understanding. I'll go through 3 steps. What do we have today in terms of norms? what are the current challenges, and what can we think in terms of way forward. So what do we have today? I definitely share the assessment of Ambassador Sood, but I'd like that we don't say the international community has remained idle in face of space challenges. Indeed, the treaties on space are back to the 60s and 70s, and we're facing an outer space domain which is really much different to the one which was back then. But we have a lot of initiatives which have been carried out since 2007, since the Chinese asset test, which really worked as a wake-up call for the international community, and the acknowledgement that outer space is vulnerable, and then we need to ensure its sustainability. So first and foremost, outer space is not outlaw. International law is fully applicable to outer space, including the UN Charter, as the Outer Space Treaty recalls it. Second, a body of norms has been constituted since the recent years, even though it has been so discreetly and through norms of behavior, non-legally binding norms. I'll go really quickly through the four main texts that I have identified myself. The COPUOS debris mitigation guidelines, which tells us to avoid any intentional destruction of in-orbit assets and harmful activities that can generate long-life debris, which tells us also to mitigate the risk of debris creation throughout the whole life of space assets. The second text is the TCBM GGE's report back in 2013, which has, for my understanding, two main bodies of rules. First, exchanging information, so increasing transparency, information on states' space policies, on states' military expenditures pertaining to space, and also encouraging visits of facilities. And another body of norms which has more to do with risk reduction notifications. So the DG has advised to notify children maneuver which can carry risk, to notify emergency situation, to notify intentional orbital breakup. Third text are the 21 agreed guidelines on long-term sustainability of outer space, which have been discussed and negotiated in the framework of the COPUOS. And here again, we do have best practices which cover, for example, enhancing registration practices or sharing of orbital information on space objects, collection of space debris information, and conjunction assessment in all orbital phases. And last but not least, and this text has been referred to a couple of times yesterday at the inaugural dinner, the EU Code of Conduct, which, in fact, has been reincorporated in the text mentioned just before. A lot of its material has been used to nourish the discussions of the GG and of the COPUOS. Plus, it had the idea also to have points of contacts between parties of the code and a consultation and dispute settlement mechanism, which has, for me, a lot of value. So again, this context, what do we need to do today? I would say implementing what has been discussed and going further. For me, there are two challenges. One, which is regulating space traffic, which is becoming more and more congested. We've been talking a lot about it. And second, preventing the destabilizing arms race in outer space. In face of the first objective, I would say that we need to implement what has already been agreed, and for example, LTS guidelines. Those guidelines have been agreed in June 2018. They're standing there, and it's up to states to actually implement them when needed through national legislation. So how do we make sure that those best practices trickle down to space operators? We also need to involve relevant actors. As we said, democratization of access to space, private companies, universities are relevant actors. How do we make sure that they participate in discussions so that rules which are agreed are applied because applicable by all? With the second objective, which is preventing destabilizing arms race in outer space. I think we first need to acknowledge difficulties. I think the outcome of the GG Paros, which Daniel is going to probably talk about a bit later, and even the outcome of the LTS discussion last year just prove how difficult it is to have states with capabilities truly going at the negotiating table and agree on something. We face an objectively complicated strategic environment with growing rivalries between great powers, with lack of trust, and hence lack of interest in actually talking about international regulation. So we need to be pragmatic and realistic. And we also need to move out from the debate on form. We've been talking for years about soft law against legally binding treaty to the detriment of content. And so we need to look at substance. We need to propose concrete and verifiable propositions which build together confidence and enhance security, and which in the end will be implemented by the main powers we're thinking about. So such steps, concretely, what could we think about in terms of way forward? And again, it's Sophie's thinking, really modestly. With regard to the first objective, regulating space traffic, I believe we need to promote and support national implementation of the recommendations which have been discussed and which are standing there. What about gathering the existing text, because there are many, and having a political endorsement of them by a lead of countries, which would commit to implement them in practice? Maybe that would create emulation, and maybe they would send a message that, soft law, non-legally binding norms actually can do the job. What about proposing a review mechanism which could assess how further we go in implementing those norms each year? This could be set through a UN General Assembly's resolution and maybe monitored by UN USA. We need also to adopt a multi-stakeholder approach. What about going further in dedicated forums to encourage discussion between state actors and non-state actors? Of course, it's being the case to a limited extent. We do have observers to the COPUOS, which are non-state, and those observers sit in the room, listen to the discussion, and share ideas informally in the margins with state representatives. And we know that UNUSA has laid down a plan to interact more with industry and private actors last year. And so the idea is we need to go further. Maybe we can also encourage interactions outside dedicated fora, and we can be inspired by what is being done in other domains, which are quite similar to outer space, and I'm thinking of cyber. So promoting a multi-stakeholder approach, I'm not advertising a French initiative, but what I have in mind is a Paris call for trust and stability in cyberspace. The idea being we have different stakeholders, state, non-state, organization of civil society coming together and saying we do agree on the same set of principles and we're gonna act towards enhancing them wherever it needs to be. Toward the second objective, with regard to preventing a destabilizing arms race in outer space, I would only outline 4 focuses, 4 priorities. The first one being avoiding detrimental consequences to the sustainability of outer space, especially through the creation of debris. We can think of a norm preventing the international destruction of space assets, resulting in the creation of multiple long-life debris. We can regulate close proximity rendezvous approaches to ensure that they are carried out in a responsible manner and they don't lead to collisions with the creation of debris. Second, we should try to avoid misunderstanding that are the sources of clashes. And for this, maybe we can think of a norm about refraining from harmful interferences that will incapacitate or bring about denial or damage of space assets. And we can also pre-notify activities carrying out risk for other space assets. Third, increasing transparency. officially stating what is the state policy in outer space, what are the capabilities, are a confidence measure which matters. And finally, again, going back to the idea of setting up a consultation mechanism to resolve any misperception, any dispute. I think yesterday my ambassador refers to an activity of a Russian satellite which created worries back in Paris. What about we would have had something more concrete agreed on? We need to keep safe distance from satellites. And on this common understanding, France would knock at the door of Russia and say, what's happening there? I'll stop there and happy to discuss.
Thank you, Sophie. Can I now pass on the mic to Jessica? Sure.
No, she needs to click up the slides.
Oh, you need to share some slides, I think.
Is this on? What is? Okay. Are they up? Perfect. Okay, I'm holding too many things. Hi, thank you for having me here today. My name is Jessica West.
I can do the slide.
And I work in civil society on a project called the Space Security Index, which aims at increasing trust and transparency as a way of facilitating global governance in space. And activities within the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS, figure highly in our work. So I'll spend some time today to reflect on the role of this body as the key focus, really, of global space governance, recent successes, and some of the challenges that I think it's going to face going forward, especially if it seeks to have more of a leadership role on some of the collective challenges that we face. I think to understand where COPUOS is today and why it's I think should be a stronger focus of space governance, it's important to reflect on where it comes from. And as the ambassador mentioned, COPUOS really emerges at the dawn of the space age. It's been with us from the beginning, and it's been mandated to be the core body within the UN that facilitates international cooperation for the peaceful uses of outer space. And this includes both scientific and technical cooperation as well as legal cooperation. It's where the 5 treaties were negotiated for outer space. It's the key forum for exchanging national information on space activities, the only real global forum for that. And if we want to jump ahead to the present, it continues to, I think, demonstrate its relevance with its quickly growing membership. So as of this year, it has 92 members. I think there's more waiting to join. Every year, there's more waiting to join. And it has 41 observer organizations. So when we talk about growing democratization of space and growing participation in space, the diplomatic focus of this really is the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses. And so to me, it's obvious that this is a place to look for renewed leadership on global governance. And I think the body's had some recent successes. Sophie mentioned the long-term sustainability guidelines in outer space, and I think the importance of this process really can't be overstated. It's one of the most significant advances in global space governance that we've really had since, say, 1979. And so that breakthrough, I think, is really important from a collective perspective and from a community perspective. Sophie mentioned some of the details of them, but the focus is really on cooperation and capacity building so that we can collectively address some of the challenges that we share in outer space. So it emphasizes information sharing, capacity building. And I think what is really important to note is that it applies to all actors in space. And this was a big, I think, a big achievement of the guidelines. So the text of the document specifically emphasizes that all space missions should be in compliance with peaceful uses of outer space and sustainability. That includes national defense and security missions, as well as some of the new uses that we're seeing. So small satellites are also expected to comply. And I think that was one of the biggest breakthroughs that they had. I want to make sure I don't forget anything. The committee is also working on some of the other, I guess, collective challenges that are faced from a natural environment perspective. So there's ongoing work on space weather and near-Earth objects to try to coordinate global capacity for prediction and for response. And they've also been successful in adding new topics, not for negotiation, but for discussion, and that includes space traffic management as well as sort of resource utilization. Both of those are in very early stages of discussion, but getting them on the agenda, I think, was a positive step and probably not the easiest thing to do. So in my mind, and I think the mind of many others, the long-term sustainability goals in particular serve as sort of an example of how we might move forward on additional governance mechanisms in outer space. So if we want to take that as an example of something positive that can happen, then I think it's really important to understand how it worked and what made it successful. The first thing to note is that the process really emphasizes consensus and cooperation, and building that from the beginning so that we can step-by-step move forward on some of the more technical challenges that are faced. And as a negotiating body, what I think is really interesting too is that there's really a strong emphasis on technical and legal expertise. So to me, it kind of starts from the bottom, starts from very practical, specific challenges, people who have expertise on those, and moving ahead on how we can start challenging them, rather than starting with a very big problem at the top and then trying to move down into the technical details. The body has fairly broad engagement. Geographically, obviously, it's got great state representation, but I think there is an effort to engage civil society and industry to the ability that or at least to a certain extent, more than some of the other forums that we're going to hear about. And it's also benefited from terrific diplomatic leadership, and I think that really cannot be overstated. The long-term sustainability goals probably were successful in a large part because we had Peter Martinez from South Africa, who's now the executive director of Secure World Foundation, who really led and stuck with that process for 8 hard years. And I think a key lesson for me is that these things don't move forward without that diplomatic commitment and people who are willing to take ownership of a topic. And it had a strict focus on peaceful uses, which means that it avoids touching on some of the pricklier issues where there's less consensus, and is able instead to focus on areas where there's agreement that we have to work together on challenges. So I think those things make it successful. Next. The question for me then, or for you, is does the committee have a plan going forward? So we've had these successes. What comes next? And the short answer is yes. And that is being formulated largely under the Space 2030 agenda. That's kind of a rather convoluted process that started with the lead up to Unispace Plus 50, the actual meetings that took place last year, and now the 2030 agenda that's supposed to take the body into the future. And the pillars of that process are really intended to make COPUOS relevant and strengthen its role in global governance. So they want to focus on enhancing COPUOS as a platform for global cooperation, extending the benefits to space for sustainable development, and from a global governance perspective, it includes a desire to demonstrate that the committee can continue to respond to emerging challenges in the 21st century. It's a really big agenda and a really big vision. At this point, it's a vision, so the question now is whether or not it will be able to implement this rather ambitious agenda and what that implementation will look like. Next. So where are we with this? I had a hard time figuring that out. There's sort of been a lot of discussion about what Space 2030 will look like, but in reality, the details are still being fleshed out. So there is a new working group to come up with an implementation plan. They're still at draft 0, but they're supposed to be tabling this by 2020. There's a few concerns that building consensus, especially with a new working group where you have new sets of negotiators, will be slow and it might be delayed. But in the meantime, there is work that's happening on space weather and coordination. There's an ongoing or a new agenda item to really try to bring more players into the global space exploration conversations. If we're thinking of some of the governance challenges that will come from a renewed focus on exploration, I think that's a positive initiative to try to broaden the discussion and the participation, and a new agenda item on space and global health. But there's challenges. I think that COPUOS, like many other UN bodies, will be challenged to exert the type of leadership role that it envisions in the Space 2030 documentation. The first one is how ambitious will implementation of the plan be? And where will the focus be? I showed you that there's sort of 3 big prongs to the Space 2030 agenda, but like most bodies, there's limited resources, And states have limited resources to contribute as well from a diplomatic perspective, so it's not clear where the focus will be, if it will be on spreading the benefits of space technology, or if they'll really focus on that space governance pieces. Also, I highlighted the process as part of the success of COPUOS, especially the LTS guidelines, but that's also part of the challenge that they're going to face. Consensus is slow and consensus is hard, and it becomes more slow and more difficult, I think, as you add players and as you pick off the low-hanging fruit that LTS really was focused on and try to move ahead on some of the more contentious issues. So replicating that success might be difficult, and we're seeing some of this happening with the LTS guidelines right now. So yes, they were adopted, yay, I think that was a huge accomplishment. On the other hand, there's no agreement on how to move forward with those guidelines right now. So they couldn't agree on a final report, they couldn't agree on how to forward those to the UN General Assembly, and perspectives among states are divided about whether this is the end of the process, a pause in the process, or there's more work to do, if we should be focusing on national implementation, as Sophie said, or if we should be focusing on expanding the number of guidelines. So it's kind of stalled. I think there's also some critical structural issues that'll have to be addressed in the long term. A lot of the questions that we're going to be facing, I think someone mentioned last night, the challenge of thinking about how the Outer Space Treaty applies to some of the new challenges. And this is one of the rare treaties that really doesn't have a review mechanism or a meeting mechanism where states can get together and collectively discuss, the vision of the treaty going forward and how does it apply today. It doesn't make the treaty irrelevant, but it does mean that there might be a lot of competing interpretations of space law as we apply them to new problems, and that could be problematic for governance. And then there's the security conundrum. So I mentioned that COPUOS focuses exclusively on peaceful uses of outer space, and anytime an issue is raised that sort of has a security tinge to it, or could be looked at from a security perspective, it sort of gets shut out as beyond the mandate of COPUOS. And I think that helps it move forward on some of the less contentious issues. But when we look at some new challenges that we're facing, such as on-orbit servicing or proximity operations, these are issues that really blur safety and security. And if we're not going to be able to talk about them because they are security issues, then it might be difficult to have, I think, comprehensive approaches to dealing with them. So the risk to me is that we have unilateral action or a fragmentation of governance. And I would like to not see that. I think it would be sad. I think it would be a missed opportunity to really move forward collectively. Last slide. All right, so I'll do my own little pitch. If you want more information on COPUOS or the many, many, many other activities that are happening in outer space, I encourage you to look up the Space Security Index, and I have put out some executive summaries of our document.
Thank you, Jessica. Let me now ask Daniel to take on our next presentation.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I think I've gotten the rather difficult task of discussing the security side of the UN processes and what we're trying to do at the moment in order to deal with the challenges that are arising for everyone in terms of security. Just as an outset, my name is Daniel Porras. I'm the Space Security Fellow at UNIDIR. It is a think tank that is within the United Nations. So we are independent. We do our own objective analysis of various security issues, in particular on things like nuclear and emerging technologies. But we also have convening power, so we can host meetings like the UN Space Security Conference that will be held at the end of May. Over the last year and a half, 2 years, the United Nations has actually seen a number of processes go forward that were looking at space security. And it's probably the first time in quite a long time that any of these issues were being discussed in so much depth. So I'm going to be discussing 3 initiatives, and then I'll tell you what happened with those initiatives, and then I'll tell you what some of the challenges are that we're going to have to face if we want to deal with some of the problems that were presented. So the 3 initiatives are the United Nations Disarmament Commission, which meets in New York. They have a working group on transparency and confidence building measures, or TCBMs, which are focused on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. There is a group of governmental experts, which was looking at further measures also on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And there was the Conference on Disarmament, which formed a subsidiary body also looking at the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And just so I don't have to keep spitting that huge mouthful out, the acronym for the prevention of an arms race in outer space is PAROS. Not Paris, PAROS. So the first one, the United Nations Disarmament Commission Working Group 2 on TCBMs. The focus of this group was to look at actually implementing certain voluntary measures that could be taken in order to strengthen stability and security in outer space. This group has a 3-year work plan starting in 2018, and they're supposed to be meeting in 2018, 19, and 20. It's open to all UN member states that meet in New York, and they can all come together and talk about different ways to actually implement some of the great ideas that have come out since, say, 2013. They met in 2018, and not a lot of discussion in that particular sense. And they have just wrapped up another meeting. Unfortunately, due to some political gridlock, the UNDC was not actually able to meet formally. So the chair had to meet informally so that they could actually have some informal discussions. UNIDIR was invited to be a technical expert and to provide some briefings on various issues that are being faced in outer space at the moment. And we also provided some ideas on the ways that you could operationalize some of the transparency and confidence building measures that have been suggested. These included some things like ASAT test guidelines, the sharing of information and policies for space security, in particular relating to different types of counter space capabilities, and also the, what was the other one? Well, we can come back to that one later. But again, as I said, this group has not been able to meet formally this year, and it's rather unfortunate because this could be one avenue where we could be exploring some of the voluntary measures that could be pursued. Now, another group that met, the Conference on Disarmament, which meets in Geneva for three different sessions every year, and these are extended periods. In 2018, they did something miraculous. They took a decision. The Conference on Disarmament has not actually been able to take a decision in something like 20 years. So it was actually quite surprising that they said, look, we're experiencing a lot of problems in just figuring out how to talk to each other. So how about if we form some working groups or subsidiary bodies that can look at individual agenda items and try and figure out how we can move these agenda items forward. So subsidiary body 3 was assigned PAROS. They elected a chair who I think was a brilliant diplomat, Ambassador Guillermo Patriota from Brazil. He handles the room very, very well. Not a space expert, doesn't necessarily know all the technical aspects, but he really understands the politics behind space security. This group met 6 times and also had some issues with politics, in particular because Syria had assumed the presidency of the Conference on Disarmament during the time that the subsidiary bodies were going to be meeting. Now, the significance of that is that one major space power, i.e. the United States, decided that they were not going to participate in anything that had to do with the Conference on Disarmament while Syria had the presidency. So for 5 of the meetings, the United States was not in the room, and then they did come back for the last meeting that was held in August. I got to tell you, I wasn't so sure that we were going to get a report, but somehow, miraculously, Ambassador Patriota was able to bring everyone together, and they managed to agree on a report. Then it went to the plenary of the Conference on Disarmament, and unfortunately, that's where the politics was just, it was insurmountable. So ultimately, that last year, the Conference on Disarmament was not able to adopt its usual report, which it then sends to the General Assembly. The most they could do was adopt a procedural report, which just says, we came, we met, we talked, that's it. List of parties that made statements. But the report that the subsidiary body was able to put together was annexed to this procedural report and is available publicly. So people can actually read it and see places where, you know, some of the challenges that were agreed upon, some of the different ways that they might be met, and it had some good ideas in there that we can maybe build upon in the future. Again, this year, politics caught up to us. The Conference on Disarmament had hoped that they would be able to reconvene the subsidiary bodies, but other external issues made it impossible for them to agree, and ultimately the subsidiary bodies are just going to have to sit and wait for maybe next year. Who knows? Then there was the Group of Governmental Experts on PAROS, which I'm sure lots of you have heard about. This is a closed group of 25 experts from different countries. So it was Russia, China, France, Italy, Germany, South Africa, Nigeria, Chile, and this group was also chaired by Ambassador Petrota of Brazil. They were mandated to look at elements of a legally binding instrument for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. So not voluntary measures, but a treaty. And that's very specific because for a long time, a number of space actors have been pretty persistent that this is just not the right time to be pursuing a treaty. That's probably because at the moment, especially between some of the big space actors, there's a very, very low level of trust between them. But nevertheless, they decided, look, we're going to get together and try to talk about a treaty and see if we can come up with a recipe for something to prevent an arms race in outer space. And they met for two-week sessions, one in August and then the last one in March. Again, UNIDIR was the technical expert for this. Raji came to Geneva and helped me tremendously with these meetings. But we were not able to come to consensus. After some very, very heavy discussions and very late nights, it just wasn't possible. We got to the very end, and some people said, look, the report that has been put together, unfortunately, it gives the impression that there's a lot more consensus than there really is in the room. So they decided that they did not want to publish the report in their personal capacities because they didn't want to give that impression that we had come to an agreement or that we were at a stage where we were ready to begin negotiations on a treaty on Paros. Things have taken a very interesting turn lately, though. For any of you that have colleagues who are working in the UN Disarmament Commission, you will know that last week the African Union put forth a statement which annexed the final draft of the GGE report, and it is our understanding that at present the chair of the UNDC is planning to make that a working paper, which means that the report of the GGE will be made publicly available. Now, this is also a very contentious action. In some ways, it kind of undermines the confidentiality of the GGE process. This is supposed to be behind closed doors, and a lot of the documentation that we put together in that room stays in the room. However, some of the participants in the GGE decided, look, we've got some good stuff here. It would be a shame to let it go to waste. Let's at least show where there is some good convergence on various issues. So we don't know if that is going to become publicly available yet or not, but we'll see. The game continues. Now, I just want to run through 3 challenges real quick that I think emerged that we could be looking at. So one is scope. Do we take on all space security issues in one go, or do we try to divide it up so that we can try and deal with different issues with different instruments? For example, you could deal with kinetic instruments or destructive capabilities in one treaty, and then maybe deal with electronic things in another. 2, definitions. We still don't have a definition for a space weapon. We still don't have a definition for what is an armed attack on a space asset. And finally, verification. Because there is such low levels of trust at the moment, people don't want to take other states' words for whether or not they're complying with a treaty. Therefore, a treaty needs to be independently verifiable by other states, which means being able to prove or to confirm that somebody is adhering to the treaty. These are 3 really big challenges. But I think now that we know that they're there and that we've at least begun to expand on them, we can try and face them in some of these different processes. However, I'm not sure what's going to happen next, so we'll see.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Let me now ask Victoria to have the last word.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good morning, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a private operating foundation that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote a global cooperative approach to push for best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is usable to and accessible for everyone over the long term. If you were here yesterday, you would have seen our global counter-space threat assessment. I'll be talking more about that later on today, but we have a lot of documents on our website, swfound.org, that may be of interest to you. I'll be wrapping up the session today to talk a little bit about norms of behavior and the importance there. Outer space is still a shared domain, which means the international community must generally agree, broadly speaking, about what is considered to be responsible use of space and how sustainability can be maintained and encouraged. Yet often discussions about how to ensure the stability and predictability of the domain revert to traditional arms control responses that are no longer useful. When discussing how to prevent conflict on Earth from extending to space, or vice versa, a formal treaty-making process should not be the only solution. The high degree of technological change makes it difficult to settle on a specific legal answer, and the growing number and diversity of states engaging in space makes it difficult to find consensus, as we've heard earlier today. Instead, the focus should be on developing norms of behavior that can begin to have a positive impact now, and may also lay the foundation for future treaty regimes. These norms should be focused on actions and behavior in space that will ensure that space is predictable, peaceful, and continually accessible to all. This is not to say that it establishes principles of non-aggression should not be underlined. Foundational documents to space security and sustainability, like the Outer Space Treaty and the UN Charter, are applicable to space, and they're still relevant. But focusing solely on new treaty mechanisms, in particular bans on specific technology, are unlikely to yield the near-time benefits that are so desperately needed. Sorry, I too am juggling a lot of stuff. I wish I had it. No, that's all right. Thank you, though. So it is more useful to focus on behavior that may positively or negatively affect the space environment. And that rather than to keep having the same argument about restricting or prohibiting technology that has been going on for decades now. This focus on stabilizing behavior can be enacted in the four following ways. 1, the strongest way to improve security and stability of the space domain is to increase the transparency of space activities. A key way to do this is by improving space situational awareness, SSA, collection, analysis, and sharing. Having an informed, objective, and trustworthy view of what is happening in orbit will do much to mitigate concerns about activities of space actors. Making space object registries more accessible, transparent, and interoperable will help with that too, as will promoting the expedited registration of space objects once they have been launched. To underline this point, improving the quality of and access to SSA data for all states would do much to strengthen the stability and reliability of space assets, and thus the domain itself. 2, a second way to focus on specific examples of irresponsible behavior that the international community could agree upon. One example that could have some traction is an agreement not to deliberately create long-lasting debris on orbit through the testing of anti-satellite or missile defense weapons, an issue that I think is special relevance today, given the activities of last month by India. Initial voluntary moratoriums by individual states could eventually lead to binding international agreements. Concerns about verifiability could be addressed by leveraging recent improvements in SSA that could allow for widespread monitoring and attribution of behavior on orbit. 3, another area that is a high priority to address is rendezvous and proximity operations, or RPO, also known as close approaches. A wide variety of governments and commercial entities around the world are developing RPO technology for military, intelligence, civil, and commercial uses. While many of these uses could yield immense benefits for space sustainability and security, such as debris removal or fixing satellites, a failure to be transparent about them could create misperceptions or mistrust that increase stability or risk of conflict. The international community could be focusing on developing norms of behavior for discriminating between commercial and civil RPO and national security RPO, and for increasing the safety of all kinds of RPO activities. And here I'd like to stop and talk a little bit about some recent commercial actions. I think when the international community talks about how can we improve transparency and confidence building, we tend to look at, okay, what can nation states do? But as we all know, there are many stakeholders in space. A growing, powerful stakeholder is the commercial sector. And based in this room, I know there's a lot of new space actors here as well. The commercial sector can create norms of behavior, does not have to be just state actors. And one such activity is an activity that's being sponsored by DARPA in the United States, the Consortium for the Execution of On-Orbit Servicing, or CONFERS. This is a group of commercial actors who do RPO activities. They've gone together to discuss, okay, what do we recommend for guidelines and behavior for responsible RPO activities in orbit? It's being paid for by DARPA, but the idea is that eventually the commercial actors will take on the financial contribution of that themselves. And full disclosure, Secure World is a part of this discussion. We're one of the guiding members of the discussions. So these commercial actors have already been able to come up with recommended guidelines and responsible on-orbit operations. So there is the idea they're going to take these actually to ISO in June and try and get an ISO standard done for that, which is a big deal from a technical standpoint. So it is possible for the commercial sector to take the lead and look at norms of behavior and figure out what they need to make sure that space is accessible and usable and go from there. A final TCBM that is often overlooked is a commitment to sharing information about national policies, budgets, documents, and legislations related to space security and stability. Often, the only information that can be found about national activities in orbit is what's in news reports, which is also often limited to reporting on what actually happened and then conjecturing about why it is done, allowing for lots of room for misinterpretation. Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty already obliges states to share to the greatest extent feasible and practicable the nature, conduct, locations, and results of space activities. However, this language is not clearly instructive in how states can comply. Proposals for how to enhance existing practice could add significant transparency to state activities in space. So there is an opportunity to break out of the morass of the last 2 decades in developing new ideas for enhancing the sustainability and security of outer space. The most pragmatic way forward is to focus on proposals for specific norms of behavior that lay the foundation for future legal agreements. Concurrently, increased focus on enhanced global SSA capabilities can help increase knowledge about space activities, potential threats and challenges, and verification of future behavior-based agreements. With that, I'd like to stop and listen to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we've heard 4 very clear presentations. Jessica spoke about COPUOS, which is short for Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, set up in 1959, widest representation, 92 countries and 40 plus international organizations as observers. But then she also pointed out that it focuses exclusively on peaceful uses. So the moment there is something which somebody feels is a non-peaceful use, that country has a right to take it outside its ambit. Well, Daniel spoke about the Conference on Disarmament and PAROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space, an item that was inscribed on the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament. And that's precisely why this item got inscribed in 1982 on the CD's agenda, because CD, by definition, is the negotiating platform for disarmament treaties. And so therefore, because COPUOS focuses on peaceful uses, they felt that with increasing risks of militarization or weaponization of space, you needed to deal with it from the disarmament perspective, and therefore it was introduced in the Conference on Disarmament, but has, since that time, has not been able to negotiate anything since 1982 on this particular item. I think he also pointed to the difficulties of the work in the UN Disarmament Commission as well as in the Group of Governmental Experts. Sophie told us about the fact that international law is applicable to outer space by definition, which means that the UN Charter is applicable to outer space, which means common heritage of mankind, right of self-defense, non-aggression, etc., etc. But that is too general a prescription to actually ensure that outer space remains available to us for collective good and collective benefit. So how do you strengthen the legal regime? And that is the first question, through norm building or through treaty negotiation. I think Sophie talked of 2 areas of focus. One was managing increasing volumes of space traffic, which is the peaceful side of it, which is the COPUOS side of it. And the second was preventing an arms race in outer space, which is the disarmament side of it. So clearly you have two separate tracks, you have two separate bodies. Both of them have a mandate to deal with their respective tracks, but clearly they've not been, the politics has not permitted them to move forward. You know, the first aeroplane, the Kitty Hawk, Wright brothers, the flight took place in 1903. By 1914, the first commercial flight was taking place. And the International Civil Aviation Organization was set up in 1944, 30 years. So if you look at the space age, 57 was Sputnik, and 61 was Yuri Gagarin, the first man who went into space. It's taken us much, much longer than that, and I think we are still far away. So I just leave that as a thought, and in case any of you have any comments to make, sure? And then I can, okay. So I open up the floor for any questions. Yes, please identify yourself. Yeah, the mic is coming to you.
Yeah. European Space Policy Institute, just a question for like both Daniel and Jessica. Do you think there is like room for coordination or like cooperation like between the CD and COPUOS? And if yes, like what the scope would be? Thanks.
Cooperation between CD and COPUOS.
Yeah, so that was one of the, maybe not direct cooperation, but at least better coordination was one of the objectives of the 2013 GGE on TCBMs. And there's been, I think, 2 meetings of the first and the fourth committee, but they haven't, I mean, I was at the second one and they didn't, I don't think they achieved very much. You know, rather than, and I think there's probably a lot of procedural challenges to having that. I guess my approach would be for COPUOS to start maybe asking different kinds of questions. So you sort of have this loggerheads in both bodies on some of the pressing issues that to me are in between safety and security. They touch on both. And I don't know, when you get stuck, ask any question. And I liked Victoria's presentation on the proximity operations and some of the new technologies that are being used in outer space. And I think there would be a lot of room for COPUOS at least to fill in some of this gray space between these two bodies by asking a safety question and just focusing on a safety question on some of the technologies and then let the CD do what it will or will not.
Yeah. I think coordination between the CD and COPUOS will continue to be tricky, but the agencies and maybe some of the groups that meet around those two might be able to do a little bit more in order to maintain the coordination. For example, the Secretary General last year issued his disarmament agenda, and in it he calls for deepening engagement by the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNIDIR, and UN USA, the Office for Outer Space Affairs, to develop new norms and to try and strengthen the existing rules of the rules of the road that are starting to emerge through behavior. And so I think just there, by getting those 3 bodies to try and coordinate a little bit better, to cooperate a little bit more, and then to use that cooperation with states, it gets everyone talking about different topics. Because particularly with with space security, we often see that there are a few states that dominate the conversations. But everyone has an interest because everyone is a space beneficiary. So I think by bringing in some more states that are not the traditional space actors and getting them to have a meaningful voice within these bodies will help to form a lot of political pressure, particularly as we see the space economy maturing more and more, and you'll see a lot more resources coming from these non-traditional space actors. So I'm hoping that will actually create a lot more cooperation between both bodies.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think this is how UNUSA, the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, sees its role under the diplomatic pillar going forward, is serving as sort of an interlocutor between different bodies, including the UN Disarmament Commission. But that implementation plan is not done yet.
Hello. Yeah, I am Shantanu Datta calling from the Kalpana Chawla Center for Space and Nanosciences, Kolkata. Actually, my question is to Sophie itself. It's more relevant to her. 1.5 this is a sample example which I'm giving, but it can be carried out to other things also. One of the companies of United States producing microsatellites, they were barred in United States because they were non-trackable, but they came to India and they were launched from here. So it's a question, it's not for lower cost or for technicalities that are non-trackability, and who takes the responsibility and liability of such, two national policies and some were commercial actors sneak in? Who takes the responsibility and the liability of anything that happens in this case?
I'll take a shot. So you're referring to the swarm. That was the 4 satellites were considered too small, so the FCC did not allow their launching. It wasn't that they were shopping for someone who would launch them. They said, who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? Who's going to do it? No, U.S. won't. Okay, we're going to go to India. They had always planned on going to India to be launched in the PSLV. Their procurer had told the Indians that they had the proper licensing and registration, and then the swarm people just never got it. And then afterwards it was launched. The FAA was looking at registrations like, wait, what? Who, you got launched where? And so that's when it came from there. But it does come down to, as you said, who's in charge of these sort of things. India did nothing wrong. There was no responsibility on Indians' part to make sure that the proper licensing authority in the United States had been followed. I will say when this happened, it could have gone 2 ways. The commercial sector could have said, all right, we don't need to follow the rules anymore. We'll just go to a flag of convenience site and have them launch our stuff and everything's good. Or the commercial sector could be like, no, that's not a good idea. We don't want to see that sort of thing happening. This is very bad. And actually the commercial sector went the second route. They were pretty critical. They recognized that it's not to their benefit to have people not following the rules. And Swarm was hit, I wouldn't say with a big fine, but a reasonably sized fine. And they have had some discussions about whether future satellites would actually get the FCC licenses if this happened again. So it was a slap on the wrist, but it was a slap. Hopefully they won't follow it again. But I think it does point to the need for international cooperation and just communication about these sort of things.
Yeah, just to add on to that, the size of the fine, it was something like $900,000 US, so less than $1 million. The concern that raises, though, at the fact that it was so low, is that sometimes space operators or manufacturers have to meet certain deadlines or milestones in order to be able to keep the either contractually they have certain milestones that are built in with their other partners, or with the ITU or other various agencies. They have to meet certain milestones in order to be able to continue their operations. The concern here is that the fine is so low that every once in a while companies might say, well, even if we didn't manage to get the license, we still have to meet a milestone of launching something by a certain date. So let's just go ahead and take the slap on the wrist later and go ahead and launch without a license at the outset. So that could be one potential danger. The other problem is that it's not totally clear if something had happened with the swarm satellites, which are 10 by 10, so pretty small satellites, and at fairly low orbit. But had they struck something or hit something, there are some questions about who the ultimate state of liability would be. Is it India as the launching state? Is it the United States as the state where the operator is located? That hasn't quite been sorted out just yet. But both states could ultimately be liable in the end. So one option that might be taken up going forward is every country and every telecommunications regulatory agency publishes their licenses. I think the United States FCC publishes monthly. I believe TRI also publishes fairly regularly. It wouldn't be terribly difficult to be able to check up on who has actually obtained their licenses.
Thank you. Yes.
So, hi, I'm Divyanshu from Rocketeers. My question is for Daniel. You talked about a lot of discussions and how people came, people met, and people talked, and there was no sort of agreement. But when we think about space assets and the way we are moving forward with tech and how we want to utilize it, all the interests seem to be strategically aligned for all players. Everybody wants to protect it. Everybody wants to utilize it and exploit it. So where does all of this hardcore sort of disagreement come from?
It's a lot of it really is political. It does come down to politics and the different interests that people have. So I'll give you a great example. The Russians and the Chinese put forward a proposal on a treaty for the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space, including the threat or use of force in space. Now, the reason that they've put that idea forward is it at least from the way they've painted it, they're really concerned about the United States deploying missile interceptors in orbit, so Star Wars. Now, a number of think tanks have done some really great research on this, and it's highly unlikely that something like that is going to happen in the next, say, 50 to 100 years. It's way too expensive. The technicalities of it are not terribly efficient. And so when Russia and China look at proposals or calls for possibly having missile-based interceptors, they think this is so ridiculous that they can't possibly be missile interceptors. What they're actually planning to do is hit strikes on the ground. So that's their perspective from what the United States is doing. The United States, on the other hand, they see Russia's jamming activities. They see some of the developments that are happening in China as well, coming up with lasers or also coming up with on-orbit service vehicles. And they think, well, these are the threats that we have and that we're concerned about. So our biggest concern is not weapons in space, it's weapons on the ground that impact systems in space, or systems in space that will impact other systems in space. So they're coming at it from two very different perspectives. And they also have very different legal traditions. The Russians and the Chinese have both said, well, we don't need to necessarily come up with a verification mechanism right away. We can develop the verification mechanisms in the future. You know, the Outer Space Treaty has a prohibition on the placement of nuclear weapons of mass destruction, but there's no verification mechanism, and yet, you know, we've done just fine up to this point. But, all right, but at the same time, a lot of other countries who, you know, they say, look, what's the point of having a treaty if you can't verify it? That treaty's not necessarily going to be very effective. So if we don't have the capabilities to verify something in a treaty, then we got to find something else or a different way to approach this. Now, on the treaty side of things, there's only one proposal, and that's the Russian-Chinese proposal. So until somebody tables a different proposal or comes up with a different idea, you know, maybe something that restricts behaviors as opposed to the deployment of technology, I mean, we don't know what's possible. So those are some of the thoughts that I think we're going to have to explore in the next couple of years if we're serious about moving forward on these issues.
You know, as I mentioned to you, 1914, the first commercial flight, 1944, International Civil Aviation Organization. What had happened in the middle? Increasing use of air power in conflicts. It began in World War I. In World War II, there was carpet bombing of cities. And meanwhile, you also saw the development of rockets. I mean, nuclear weapons came the following year. But people just realized that if the civilian space, airspace was getting crowded, they needed rules of the road. So ICAO got set up even before the UN had come into being. And eventually it became a specialized agency of the United Nations a couple of years down the road. So similarly, with sufficient private sector players, commercial actors coming on the scene, it is quite possible that traffic management in space might see the light of the day in the sense of, but the outer space as an area of peaceful activity or non-militarization of outer space is something for which the train has probably already left the platform. That's too late now.
Yeah. Hi, morning. I'm Lakshmesh from Larsen & Toubro, a private company in India. We are also up there. My question is actually to all the panelists, and we are talking about the issues in the space. Now, we have had similar issues, may it be the Antarctica Treaty or may it be the international waters treaties. So is there a learning that we are able to take from these common entities on the surface of Earth and see if there is a correlation between that and take it to the outer space.
Anybody wants to take common heritage of mankind approach?
I'll just at least start the conversation by saying that yes, we do look at a number of those treaties to try and see if we can get ideas. For example, we recently had a whole discussion about the Antarctic Treaty and the provisions for states to be able to visit other scientific sites to make sure that people are only doing scientific experiments. You know, maybe we can translate that into outer space where we have on-orbit service vehicles that can do inspections on satellites and say, you know, the Americans launch something up there and then the Russians say, look, we're kind of concerned about this. We would like to just approach it with one of our on-orbit service vehicles to have a quick look at it and make sure that it's not armed. And you know, maybe they can come with an approach, I don't know, maybe get within 50 meters or 100 meters or something and take some readings and provide some confidence that, you know, there aren't weapons there. There is a provision in the Outer Space Treaty for doing just that on lunar bases or other types of installations that are on celestial bodies. So we're trying to incorporate some of them, but at the same time, the political interests in space, particularly for national security, they're so high. People really, militaries in particular, are becoming really dependent on their space assets and their space capabilities. That I think there's a lot of nervousness about what commitments will be made, in large part because they want to protect what they've got, but they also don't want to limit themselves with what they can do tomorrow. And this is where I think also the commercial sector needs to be very conscientious of these discussions and what's going on, because whatever rules do end up getting passed, because the nature of space technology is dual use. You can use it for civilian or military purposes. A lot of things can be used for defensive or offensive purposes. The commercial sector should keep an eye on it so that they don't end up working on things that tomorrow might end up being, I don't want to say prohibited, but regulated at least.
And yeah, just to build on what Daniel was saying, I mean, there is some discussion about things that could be picked from these issues, you know, for maritime, for example, the right of salvage. Saying, okay, maybe we could apply that or get some foundation from that to do with debris removal or going towards debris or that sort of thing. But the problem you run into for the Antarctic and maritime domain, and then trying to apply that to the space domain, is that the physics of the space environment are different. You know, maritime, you can have an exclusive economic zone, you can have your territorial waters, that sort of thing. You do not own space above you, despite what some countries have tried to say, like, oh, we own the geostationary slot above us. No, you don't. You do not own the low Earth orbit spot about you. There's not even a way that could be a thing. And so it's hard to say, to use that language and try and apply it towards space. You know, for Antarctic, there's an actual physical territory you can have discussions about and look at, whereas space, and again, unless you're looking at geostationary slots, it isn't really the same. And so that makes it difficult because, you know, one actor's activities can affect everyone's ability to utilize it. One of the descriptions I've heard that really strikes me is, you know, imagine if there was a war where all the bullets were still whizzing around for decades afterwards, and that's what you're looking at for the low Earth orbit environment with space debris. And so it's a challenge, and it's one of the things that, yeah, you use it, but you don't want to be hemmed in or just only focusing on language from pre-existing treaties.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, for law of the sea, that comes up quite often in terms of resource utilization, but it's quite contentious about, you know, is it analogous? Should it apply? Are there not lessons that we've learned from that we should not be doing? So there's a lot of controversy over whether or not you want to use other models for outer space. But if we're not just looking at treaties, if we're looking at how in practice areas are managed, I think there's an opportunity to look at what's happening in the Arctic right now. I'm Canadian, so the Arctic's a big thing. And it's a domain where there's also a big focus on sort of great power politics and growing militarization and, you know, potential confrontation. But I have a colleague that looks quite closely at governance, and he says that in reality on the ground, there's actually a lot of cooperation that's taking place in the Arctic. Military cooperation, a lot of Coast Guard cooperation between the major Arctic Circle countries for a safety perspective, and because there's so many commercial interests that are driving exploration, that's also facilitating greater military and sort of safety cooperation as well, and also a focus on the environment. And I think that lesson there can be extended to space, and the environment's driving, I think, efforts at restraint and mutual understandings.
Okay, thank you. Raji?
Given the time constraint, I can live without it.
Just maybe a small word, just to complement what colleagues said. I think also we could look at cyber domain again for analogous, because I mean, as Victoria said, I mean, in terms of the rules driving both systems, maybe this is closer to what governs the sea domain, and also because probably the threats that we're going to face in space are more of a hybrid nature than actually a very frontal confrontation. We're talking about like high spectrum threats, but maybe that's not the most likely ones that we're going to face in space. And as much as cyber is now today used, day to day to influence, I mean, you know what I mean, and I don't want to be too long. I think space, also because of its dual nature, can be an advantage in the rivalries between powers.
Thank you. The key here is, I mean, you actually have a 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is a fairly widely adhered to. I don't know how many states parties, 130, 140, something like that? Something like that, which is pretty good. Now, it doesn't have a review mechanism. It doesn't have a verification mechanism because people didn't think of those things at that point in time when it was being negotiated. However, there is nothing to prevent the 140 countries that are party to it to actually say that we need to just take a look and see, because it does provide a broad legal framework for peaceful uses of outer space. The question is, today's reality, the political reality that Daniel talked about, is far more toxic. And were the Outer Space Treaty to actually come in contact in that sense with today's political reality, it may not even survive. So that's basically the key difficulty. It is today's politics which makes it difficult. I think with that, I think we need to close this because we have our next speaker waiting here for us. And so may I just ask all of you to give a round of applause for the panel.